introduce Patrick Johnstone, and we are releasing his new autobiography called God's World to Win in January. And it's his life story and also the story of Operation World. Now, for those of you who don't know, Operation World is a massive prayer resource for believers that introduces them to the needs of the church around the world, and also like the needs for evangelism and just to inform people on how to pray. And it's had a huge influence on the world of missions. And I believe it's sold 2.5 million copies since 1974 when the first edition came out. So Patrick, thank you for joining me. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your book.
Thank you.
So I wanted to first jump in to talk about your life and your past experiences and how that's brought you to where you are today. So in your book, you talk about your life being like a multi-layered onion. You said you've been shaped by your family history and also God's refining work. How
Yes.
did your early experiences prepare you for the ministry that you've had all these years?
All I can say is that everything in our lives, this is now in general, I believe can be built into ministry in the future. But we often have to get rid of a whole lot of challenges that we've inherited by genetics or by history or by influences on our childhood and so on. And we've believed lies about ourselves. I can't do it, or I'm worthless, or something like that. And God has to gradually deal with those. And I know in my case, I grew up in a home that wasn't really Christian. We were nominally Christian, but we certainly had no real exposure to a personal faith in Jesus. And yet I look back and I see the way God has wonderfully helped me to learn from my past and build into my life that which will be useful for the future. I've only realized it by looking back. But then all of us inherit some of these problems. For instance, my mother, her father and mother divorced. Her mother walked out on them when she was 9, and she never really recovered from it. And so that had impact on all of us. My father was very much impacted by being the older child and a father who was a general practitioner, but in a poor country practice. He could only send the older son to university and the younger couldn't. And so he always felt an obligation, which put into me a sense of loyalty. I must do what those I am responsible to or love. I must do that which pleases them. So man-pleasing had to be dealt with. And there are so many things like that. But then again, there are the other things that happen. For instance, when I was at school once, I had to second a debate, a public debate. And I prepared my lines and tried to have everything lined up. And when I stood up and saw the people, I panicked. and I said a few lame words and sat down with acute embarrassment. And I said, I'll never be involved in public speaking, teaching, or learning a foreign language. And I had to do all of those. God has to overcome the barriers that we put up, and we think we can't do it. And yet God in his wonderful wisdom knows how to change that and to actually enable us to do what we didn't think. And I'm also grateful for, eventually, when I got to university, I studied chemistry, and I had to learn all about statistics and how to handle research and so on. And my mother always thought that I was wasting my education by going to work in slums in southern Africa. But this was also vital when I came to actually doing scientific research on the countries of the world and have to work with statistics in a way that nobody had ever done before. And so all that background came to the fore and God used it.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's always amazing to hear how God uses the different pieces of people's lives
Yeah,
and
yeah,
in just the way he wants.
absolutely. Hmm.
So your book, God's World to Win, it traces the remarkable story behind Operation World, this prayer resource. Can you share a little bit about how that project began and what developed afterwards?
When I was at university, God spoke to me through a missionary who spoke about evangelistic work in the slums of southern Africa. And I knew that's where God was calling me. And so I went out as a tent evangelist to Africa. And that's what I expected to do. It was pretty tough work and itinerant and so on. And the whole idea of writing a book was very far from us. But the little mission with which I was working had a strong emphasis on prayer. And it had come really very much from the pedigree of that great Christian South African, Andrew Murray, who's written many books that are still being read. And he had put forward the challenge that Christians ought to have weeks of prayer to pray for the world, to be evangelized. And he pushed this as a strong thing. I don't know anybody who took it up. And so the leader of our little mission took this on. And so in about 1960 or so, he started to organize prayer weeks. So almost as soon as I got to Africa, I got involved in a prayer week. And then I was asked to run one only a few months later in another part of South Africa. And then again in Kenya. And we just didn't have information. The internet didn't exist. And so I began to write sheets of paper with prayer requests for different nations. And when I got to Kenya and did this, they so loved it. They said, we've never seen anything like this. So when I got back to South Africa, I spoke to the leader of our work, and he said, Patrick, you really ought to put this in a book. And so, all right, I put it in a little booklet. It's only about 60 pages. Oh, it's only about 30 pages. And I covered quite a few countries. And we used that for several years in these occasional prayer conferences that we held. And after a time, he said, Patrick, you really ought to revise that. It's getting out of date. And so I said, well, if I'm going to write it again, I really need to cover the other countries of the world that I did not write on.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not realize what I was saying. I didn't know how many countries there were. And I was in Africa. I had no libraries. I had nothing of the facilities that people would regard as the basics to produce something like that. And then I went to work in a country which was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, which had sanctions imposed on it. And I couldn't write to most countries of the world. And it was crazy. But anyway, we put it together. And as I did it, I realized that nobody had ever written a book like that before. The last one that I knew of was William Carey, after which your organization is named. I don't know of any other world survey that had been done that had tried to give the needs of the task that still needs to be done. And so there we were, we produced it. And then we found out that when we printed the book on our mission press, we couldn't sell it in South Africa because they had a closed shop union system that a book could only be marketed if it was printed by union members.
Oh
And,
my.
and so we had to give the book away. And we gave one copy to Ralph Winter,
Okay.
just as the US Center was starting, or very soon after.
Mm-hmm.
And he so loved it, he'd not seen anything like it. He said, can we reprint it? And he did, with another title I didn't approve of, but that was Ralph Winter. And and anyway, so it went global ultimately.
Wow, that's amazing. And all before computers, and
Yes.
you were able, yeah, all this information you had to track down manually.
And actually, when I began to be more known, I came to the notice of David Barrett, who was then working on the first World Christian Encyclopedia. And so we began to work together. And I had my first attempt on his Wang computer in Nairobi.
Wow.
And was typing in information that got published in the first World Christian Encyclopedia. And so that was my first contact with a computer. And that was
Yeah.
in 1978.
Wow. After the first edition had already been published.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
of course, we didn't get a computer until we were very kindly given a grant by Mark World Vision to buy a computer because they wanted our information.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a trade-off, you know. And so they
Yeah.
gave us the money for the first computer. And so we had 6 terminals, and that computer had a huge memory of 40 megabytes. Impossible to think these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So I really see that prayer is at the heart of Operation World, and that's what it's become known for, is a key tool for prayer and informing people about how to pray. How do you see prayer as why do you see prayer, especially informed prayer, as so essential to missions work?
Well, if we don't know there's a need, we won't pray. That's I mean, you remember Paul when he said to one of the churches, I'm trying to remember which one now, from the day since we first heard it, we have not ceased to pray for you. So, I mean, Paul worked on information, and so prayer is absolutely vital, because as somebody said, prayer is the only activity that is noticed in heaven. And we see in Revelation that all the redeemed gathered before the throne. And the only thing of what is on earth that is noticed is the prayers of the saints. And so we see, I don't want to go deep into Revelation and interpretations, but when we see the horsemen of the apocalypse and all the seals opened, the first thing about it all was the saints were praying. And the last seal is about prayer. So in other words, the whole concept of prayer is that we're working together with God for the evangelization of the world, for the redemption of the world. And that is the key function for which he calls us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I know in my own life, Operation World has helped me be able to see the needs in a way different than I may have seen them if just looking at the situation by myself. So I really value having a resource
Wonderful.
like that to help with prayer.
Thank you. Mm.
So in your book, you describe how your own loss and hardships in your life have shaped your ministry. How did those difficult seasons you went through deepen your faith and dependence on God?
That's a tough one to answer because there are so many facets, but very briefly, it seems that in any work that the Spirit of God does, there is a death point. In the life of Jesus, his whole ministry became worthwhile through the death on the cross. But there is that aspect in every Christian involvement. There are death points when we are stripped of anything that we can do in our own strength, and we are forced to depend upon God alone. And I believe this is all part of the deal, as it were. We're not saved from persecution. We're not saved from troubles. God does save us from some of them, but basically it's a package deal. All who will suffer, all who will live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. So, there's always a death point. And as I look back at each of the 6 editions of Operation World for which I was responsible, there seems to have been a different death point with each one. And of course, one of them was the death of my first wife, when she managed to complete the children's Operation World, which was then entitled You Can Change the World, and now it's called Window on the World. And she finished it a week before she went to be with Jesus. And I mean, God gave her the strength for it, but I see her slaying more in her death, like Samson, than she did in her previous life of ministry. She was so fruitful in that, but there was a death point. But for me, it had a huge impact. And we'd had warning, so by God's grace, I carried on, and we produced the next Operation World the following year. But, you know, every involvement in ministry does involve pain, and often God uses this to open up new doors, to deal with things in our own lives, and also, above all, to teach us to depend on Him. It's not Him, it's not us, it's Him.
Yeah, I think you draw that out beautifully in the book, and I think a lot of readers will draw encouragement from seeing that in your own life.
Thank you.
So in your one of your later chapters in your book, you talk about leaders handing over the work, and you really emphasize the need for leaders to do this, otherwise their work will end up in the grave, so to speak.
Yes.
So how did you prepare to entrust Operation World to the next generation? And how would you counsel others who are looking at doing the same with their ministries?
I would start with a biblical verse where Timothy, when Paul wrote to Timothy, he said, "What you've heard from me before many witnesses, teach to faithful men who will teach others also." And when that became part of me, I began to realize I was called to be an evangelist, but really I was called to be a discipler. And if I'm to be a discipler with long-term results, I need to have 4 generations of those of which I'm part. And so I wanted to be a 4-generation missionary, with 4 generations, with ones I'd really helped, helping others who will help others. And by God's wonderful grace, that's happened. And for instance, one of my wonderful co-workers in Africa, Steve Lungu, who became worldwide known, his book has blessed many, but he was a teenage gangster, and he came from a terrible background. And his one ambition before his conversion was to kill his mother because she'd deserted him. But then he wonderfully got converted, but it took probably 8 or 9 years for him and others of my colleagues to reach a point where they could actually lead, because they had so many of their own issues to deal with. And so I learned then the basic principle that unless you prepare those to take over, your ministry will die. And so with everything I've done, I almost start out with the basic principle: I'm going to hand over this sometime. I run a little group in our church now, and I'm now preparing somebody to take over from me. You know, it becomes part of you, and this is what I think is essential. And we were just moved when we were in Africa, where our ministry was beginning to wind down because of the war going on in the country where we were, in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. And we really didn't know what was next. But then we read an extraordinary book of sermons. I don't usually read books of sermons, but this one is The Perils of Being 40, and we were 40. If you stick in your one ministry where you've been all that time, it's time to get out. And he used the word 16 years. And so my basic thing is, if somebody's been there in a long time, I say, what have you done to prepare others to take over from you? And some people get a bit embarrassed about that. Mm-hmm. But basically, if you start off with the principle, I must decrease, Jesus must increase in those I'm discipling too. And we want to push on to them that they get noticed, they get on, and for them to take this on board. Well, Steve, this one I told you about, he then ultimately became the leader of Africa Enterprise, another Christian mission in southern and all over Africa, a very successful leader. And he then wrote to me once, he said, I'm preparing two others to take over from me. I'm doing what to them what you did to me, he said. And
Well,
so when he died with COVID. And the Kenyan who took over from him, he wrote to me with news. He wanted to tell me something. And I wrote back to him and said, this is what I've learned about discipling. Are you others to take over from you? And he said, yes, I am. And so there was a succession, you see.
yeah.
And I think any pastor who tries to protect his empire is doomed to disaster in many cases. We've seen this too often. A pastor, a leader, must always be accountable to others, being discipled, and also discipling others and hand over as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Even to consider, like, even young people should be thinking about this.
Yes,
They think, oh, I have many years ahead and I don't need
yes,
to worry about this, but they should be
yes,
thinking in those terms.
yes. I mean, anybody that you're working with, you want to enable them, if you're responsible for them, you want to enable them to be even more than what you are.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have that attitude, I think that's the biblical one. I mean, Jesus entrusted those 11 disciples in a way that was astonishing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even after Peter had messed up in John 21, he said, go and feed my sheep. He wasn't disqualified. And I would add, actually, you know, when you're seeking to disciple those to take over, you're going to have many disappointments and rough passages that you have to go through. There's usually a death point in that process too.
Mm-hmm. What do you hope young missions folks and researchers will take away from your story in your book?
I think one of the things that I would like people to take on is that it doesn't depend on what you think you don't have. You've got a wonderful Jesus who lives in us, and he gives us his spirit to do whatever he calls us to do. And so never limit God from what you might be able to do because of your past experience. It's just like I said about that debate. I ended up preaching in 4 other languages and learning a bit of 20. Well, it's the exact opposite of what I said I thought my limits were.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really, really encouraging to hear. So after a lifetime spent calling people, believers, to pray for the nations, what's exciting you the most right now about what God's doing today?
That's a very difficult question to answer again, because we are now going through one of the biggest changes in the geopolitical world that we've had in the last 300 years. We've had 300 years of remarkable spread of Christianity, with the Western Christian nations controlling the oceans of the world. But that world is going. But what has happened during that time is that the church has become global. And some of the missions I work most closely with now are African missions. I'm just going in a few days to the celebration of Calvary Ministries, or CAPRO, from Nigeria. But they've now become an international mission with over 700 workers, and most of them working amongst Muslims all over the world from Nigeria. And they live by faith. They never ask for money.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, God is doing something. And so I think also Operation World has helped in this, because it's gone into many other languages. But basically, it's given tools to other nations of the world that didn't have the resources to know where they should go. I'm treated as a hero in Korea, because so many of the Korean 20,000 or so Korean missionaries that have now gone out look to Operation World in Korean as one of their inspirers. And so I've been encouraged by that. But then I would say that the thing that has encouraged me most is the fact that God has been working in what I call the sixth great awakening. And it hasn't really touched the Western world much, but it's touched Africa, many parts of Asia, and Latin America hugely. And we're only beginning to become aware of how many Christians there are. I mean, there's an indigenous church in Nigeria, the Redeemed Church, Christian Church of God, and they have a campsite that can seat 3 million people.
Wow.
I mean, this is on a level of Christian growth, the like of which we know nothing in the Western world now. And we get all discouraged. So I'm really encouraged by what God has been doing. But I have the proviso that we've now got to adapt to a global Christianity and work together without being paternalistic or managing, but to cooperate with God, with God's people around the world to finish the job, which is now finishable. I mean, for the first time in history, we've now got a list of all the peoples of the world. How many are Christians? How many are not? Where people are working, where they're not, where we must pray for breakthrough still. And we're beginning to see the great breakthrough amongst the Muslims now. And that is encouraging, because in 1960, we did a survey, and we reckoned that about then, there were only about 60,000 believers who'd come out of a Muslim background. But today, some say 20 million.
Wow.
And who would have thought that Muslims would be coming to Jesus? So there are encouraging things, but we have got huge challenges ahead, and we've got to adapt a lot. The old methods are not going to work.
Yeah, and prayer will be a significant part of what we do in that. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And to find out from God how he wants us to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for giving us time to hear about you, your life, and the story of Operation World. And
Well,
I'm very excited for people to get their hands on your book when it comes out in the new year.
good. Well, thank you, Maddie.
Yeah,
God
thank you.